Hello friends, I hope I'm finding you all well. So today I'm going to talk about all the books that I read in the end of November, all of December. So the last books of 2023. They're these books, if you're wondering. I read a lot of really great books. I have my computer here, I have my notes for my phone, and hopefully I'll do a better job than I usually do of explaining these books and reviewing them. So the first book I want to talk about is Scorched Grace by Margaret Dowie. This is about a nun who is tattooed, she smokes, she's queer, which is cool, and also what intrigued me about this, it's a mystery debut. And what happens at this monastery that is it called a monastery? Saint Sebastian School. There's fire, and she's kind of in the middle of it, and so she really wants to figure out how this fire happened, who's killing these random people at the monastery, I guess. It's sort of written like Nancy Drew type of deal. I don't read a lot of mystery, so maybe that's just the vibe of mystery books. But it felt very classically Nancy Drew trying to solve the mysteries. Obviously she's not very liked by the other nuns and priests at the school. I gave it 2 stars. I was not a fan of this. Maybe mystery novels are just not for me, but also there was just so many small flaws in this. The beginning is super info dumpy with the action happens, and then we get some of her backstory, and then we get basically all the clues we need. And in the first 5%, 10% of the book, I guessed who had done the arson and the murder, and I was correct, which is super disappointing. It was just a vibe, you know? And then through the middle of the book, as she keeps saying, I'm just going over the suspects in my mind, I'm just trying to think about who did it, but then we never get any information about what she's thinking in regards to who'd actually done it. So I'm I don't know what's going on inside her head, I just know that she's thinking about it, which is very useless information, and it doesn't make for a very interesting read. And then at the end, we got some more information, there was a big reveal, and I'm like, doy, of course this person did it. So I was just not invested. On top of that, even though this character description sounds really interesting, her backstory was just not woven into the story very great. And I think there was supposed to be a reveal about her backstory at some point. It wasn't effective. She didn't feel like a real person, and neither did any of the other characters. I just wasn't, for me, not good in my opinion. Disappointing. Then I picked up Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke and Other Misfortunes by Eric LaRocca. I've heard great things about this author. I was trying to find more stuff about queer horror, and obviously this person came up, and I've heard great things about them, so I was like, hell yeah, let's check this out. This one has 3 stories in it. The first one is Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke, and then the other 2, I will tell you their names now. The Enchantment, and you'll find it's like that all over. So yeah, also kind of disappointing. I ended up giving this a 3-star. The premise of Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke is super, super similar to a B storyline in Brainworms by Alison Rumfitt. And because I read that book and really loved it, and I had that storyline so well developed in my brain, reading something like this that was so similar afterwards, even though this was probably written before, just made this one seem really lackluster to me. It made me really uncomfortable. It's about this woman who starts chatting with another woman online. They develop kind of this relationship where they email back and forth, and the other becomes the ruler of our main protagonist, I guess, and tells her to do certain things. It's just not for me. Didn't feel like there was any messaging behind it. Very shallow. The second story, no thoughts. The third story, which was actually the shortest, I liked it. It felt like a really good short story, short story, and I would have liked to probably read more really short work by this author in the future, but I think because this is their most famous work and it didn't click for me, I don't think I will be picking any of their other books up in the near future. Next, I picked up The 30 Names of Night by Sain Jukadar. I thought I would love this. This is a trans American immigration story, so I felt like this would be like perfect up my alley. This follows our main character, who is a kind of newly out trans man. This is a young adult, by the way, and his mother has died, and he keeps being haunted by her ghost, and he's the sole caretaker of his grandma. And so he doesn't get out too much. He is grieving. He's trying to get to know like his transness and being accepted first himself and from the outside by that, but also like with his mother's grappling with his mother's death. And what he does to basically cope with this is he goes out at night and does this like spray paint artworks on this mural. And one time he finds this like diary of this sort of famous Syrian artist called Layla C. And he starts reading her diary, and her story kind of weaves into his story. And so every second chapter is the diaries of Layla C, and the other chapters are our main character, whose name we don't know yet, but will be revealed later in the book. And I thought like the messaging of this, like how the culture and the history and art in general, the power of art was like woven into his story of like discovering himself and finding community and starting to feel like less alone with himself and his identity, and realizing there's people, other Syrian people in his culture, other Syrian artists who are also trans, and starting to feel like this connection to his community through his culture. I thought that storyline was like really beautiful, and this book I feel like has all the markings of a book that I would absolutely love, but maybe I just read it at like the wrong time. Maybe the writing was like a little bit too lyrical for me. I think some of the characters were just like not super flushed out, and there were a little bit too many like side characters. I always was more interested in reading one perspective more than the other, and it always switched on which one I was more interested in. It just wasn't perfect. I gave it 4 stars. I believe I am so glad I read it. It has incredibly messaging. It's well written, but there was just something that just didn't click perfectly for me. But it's a really important story, and I'm so glad I got to it. Then I picked up Valencia by Michelle T. I'm so glad I finally got to this. I'm so glad that I finally got to read a Michelle T book, just because she's so famous in the lesbian world of literature. And I'm definitely interested in reading more by this author in the future. I don't know if this is fiction, memoir, or autofiction, because the main character is called Michelle, and I think this is just kind of the way that Michelle T writes her stories, where like she's kind of the main character, but also it might be a little bit fiction. I'm not really sure. If you know more about this, let me know, because I'm really curious. But this follows 1 year, I believe, in Michelle's life, living in the dyke world of San Francisco, and all the drama and relationships that she has and gets up to. It's just very lesbian, queer, incest pool of community, which is entertaining. It was entertaining to follow. There's a lot of like drugs and alcohol and people just having so many issues. This whole book is just really, really messy. Like the characters are messy. The plot is like messy, if there at all. And the writing is also a little bit messy. Like, for example, I know Michelle T does this thing where she doesn't put dialogue in quotation marks. It's just part of the text, which can take a little bit to like get used to. On top of that, I just felt like because the story lacks climax and a traditional story structure, and you're just kind of following the life of Michelle and like all the people she's dating, I felt like the character development was a little bit like lacking with all the characters. Like all the characters are super dysfunctional, and all the relationships she has super dysfunctional, but I felt like we never really got to know why, or like the psychological reasons under why these relationships wasn't really working out. It was kind of surface level and written in a way that was more like for entertainment in a way, and I did find parts of it really entertaining, and all these characters are just really bizarre. But I also kind of wish it was a little bit different, and that's just my personal opinion. I don't think Michelle T's writing is perfect for me, but I'm definitely like super interested in picking up other stuff of hers. I'm also just like not a huge fan of like reading from perspectives of like people who take drugs and party and drink a lot. It's just not really for me, but I gave it 3 stars, I think. Then I picked up this book, People Collide by Isle McElroy. So I read The Atmospherians by Isle McElroy 2, 3 years ago, I think, which was their debut. So this is their second book. And this is a body swapping story. And I haven't told you guys this yet, but I'm like obsessed with body swapping stories. Is it because I'm trans? Yes and no. I just find it like really, really fascinating to imagine all of a sudden like being in another person's body, let alone like someone you love. And when I was a kid, I have to say this, when I was a kid, I would have my mom tell me nighttime stories of like a girl, for example, one day just like waking up with a penis and just being like, oh my God, what do I do? Or in the same vein, waking up one day and just like being pregnant. And I would just like love when my mom told me these stories. And I just think it's like really fascinating to like all of a sudden be thrust into like another type of body or person and have to deal with their life. So this follows 2 people. Do I remember their names? Right, Eli and Elizabeth, who have been married for 3 years. They live in Bulgaria. Yes, they live in Bulgaria because Elizabeth is quite a good writer and she's gotten a job there, and so they got married out of convenience so that they can stay together. Eli is also a writer, but a less successful writer with a much more, I was going to say chaotic past, but dysfunctional family background. And Elizabeth comes from like a rich household, and the book starts off right off the bat with Eli waking up in Elizabeth's body and just being like, what the fuck? Elizabeth now, what he assumes is in his body, which is true, is nowhere to be found. And so he's like, I gotta find Elizabeth, and like, what the hell is going on, you know? And it's basically a contemporary written through this like one magical thing that happens, because essentially it's about their relationships, about their dreams and how they view each other and what marriage means, or like what you mean in relationship to others and like the life you cultivate with someone else. The way the story unfolds to me is just really, really interesting, because when he finally finds Elizabeth, she's like, I don't want my body back, you know? I was just like, I got all this male privilege now. I am completely free from like the pressure I felt at having this job, the success that my family wanted from me. I'm free from all of that and I can just start over again. And he's like, what the fuck? That's my body and I have no say in it, because like, what the hell do you do? And it's just like, it's so many interesting conversations. And it's about family and like, do you really know people and their experiences? And it's fun watching him discover like misogyny kind of. Yeah, because like this is a straight couple. There's also a scene where they have sex. I'm telling you way too much about this story, but it was just all really fascinating to me. And Eli, as Elizabeth, has to deal with Elizabeth's parents. And there's literally 20 pages in this book of Elizabeth's parents arguing. And I found it fascinating. And it was like literally 20 pages. And I ate it up. I think Isle McElroy has this way of making, oh, the sun's coming out. That's beautiful. These plants are dying. Okay. Isle McElroy has like a way of writing contemporary / fairly normal fiction that they also write in The Atmospherians. Such a perfect line between, is it irony or is it real? And it's like tiptoeing in between like being sort of like satire or not. And I found it like really, really fun to read. I gave this 5 stars. I know it's not really technically like a 5-star book, but just I enjoyed the premise of the plot. I loved the discussions. It never really digs super deep, but I just loved it. I thought it was really, really great. I'm definitely going to read anything that Isle McElroy writes in the future. Both of these books, this one and Atmospherians, are very different, but I just really enjoyed them both. The other one I gave 3 stars just because it's different. It's about this like cult, whatever. That's not, it's not about that book. It's about this one. I really loved it and I'm so happy I read it last month. Next I read, I just caught my computer as it was falling down. Holy shit. Next up I read Gunk Baby by Jamie Marina Lau. This is written by like an Australian author and she's younger than me, which just like amazes me. And before I start talking about this book and you get your ideas about this cover, look at the cover that I discovered this book by. I saw this in the bookstore and I saw this cover and I was like, oh my god, this is amazing, this is fascinating, I want to read this because the cover was so amazing and I'm definitely a cover by type of girly. But then this is the only one I can get my hands on and I think this cover is absolutely horrible, but the content is what matters. So this follows Lean, who lives in this, like, what is it called? Fictional city of Parmars, where there is a shopping center called Topical Heights Shopping Center, and she plans to open a ear cleaning and massage studio there. And she's currently living with this other couple, and the plot doesn't really matter because it's very everyday life if she's trying to learn stuff about how to run her own business at this shopping center, and at the same time she's going to these like evening groups that's kind of like trying to dismantle capitalism and shopping habits and punish these managers at this shopping center because they're all corrupt. And at the same time she's like trying to run her business, you know. It's kind of long, like 400 plus pages. It's just about her life and her relationships, and it's horror, question mark. It's just very eerie and weird. When I was reading this, I was finding it kind of slow and boring. I wasn't really sure what the author was doing. And then it gets just like slowly more odd. And it's definitely a commentary on this like shopping center culture of like, my partner's home. So after a slight fika break, we're back. Talking about Gunk Baby, I don't remember where I left off with this, but the author creates this feeling of something just being off, odd, and of course it is also like the setting of like this fictional city of like Parmars and fictional shopping center of Topic Heights. But also just these kind of weird things happen. The characters have very strange motivations that are never really like delved into, and then as the book goes on, it's sort of continues the same tone, but it was only like really afterwards that I truly reflected on how odd this was and how like masterfully it was crafted. Like the longer I'm away from this book, the more I start seeing this like as a masterpiece, and the way that author like uses the language and the tempo and the messaging like all woven together. I'm just, how did the author do this? And also, what did the author do? You know? And it's like, I think a lot of people can read this and just think that they like didn't accomplish what it set out to do, that it wasn't on the nose enough, that it wasn't clear, or that it was just like a kind of badly written contemporary in a way. But I think like actually it was just like really subtle and skillfully done in a way that makes you feel like really uncomfortable, because it is so similar to like stuff that happens all the time, but also it just goes that like little extra mile. And I don't know what the author did or what the hell I just like read when I read this, but the longer I wait for the better it gets. So I recommend this one, if not for this cover, for this cover. Next up, I read Natural Beauty by Ling Ling Quan. This is a horror book following our main character that I have forgotten the name of. I feel like it starts on M. So we follow our main character, who is this incredible musician, pianist, and she learned everything she knows basically from her parents that were both pianists that fled China during like the Cultural Revolution. And so she's like first generation immigrant. For whatever reason that we also discover throughout the book, she left her ambitions becoming a professional pianist and is now starting to work at this beauty store corporation called Holistic, who has this like natural beauty ideal plan. And as she's working there, she needs to like sign these contracts, she needs to take these vitamins to be in top health so she gives the best impression for the customers. But it just like spirals from there, as in things just start getting slowly like weirder and weirder. Her natural features start becoming more European. Weird things start happening with like the people working there, and she discovers more and more about this holistic company, and essentially like it explores what it means to like be connected to your heritage and therefore like connected to yourself, and also paying homage to where you came from, your family, and the beauty and the fact that you live through your parents and their history, and everything that you are is like part of that, whether you like it or not. It was very easily written, and like I flew through this. It was very captivating all the way through. And I think what this book like did really well is that the progression of the plot and the things that happen so slowly, in my opinion. Like, not that the plot is slow, but it feels like it happens slowly, especially like the horror elements, that at no point does it really feel like horror, because you're so in it that you're just buying everything the book is selling you. And I feel like it was really only at the end where I had this moment of like, oh my God, that was horrifying. Like, that's made me feel a little ill, you know? The way it talks about body horror, the messaging behind it, it's all very gross. And I think the author did this really well, because we're going on the same journey as the main character of like, we don't really realize how bad or horrifying it is until the end, when we're just like, this is not okay, you know? And I love it when books do that, where like the way it's written matches the progression of how we're feeling, and not just the plot, but the way it's constructed. And I really enjoyed that. So I gave this book 4 star. It wasn't like a new favorite for me, but I'm really glad I read it. And also there's been like quite a bit of hype of this book in like the horror literary world. So I enjoyed this. It's also like a debut, and the author is pianist herself, and like that like shows. Glad I got to it. And then I have 2 more books to talk about. This is Hell Followed With Us by Andrew Joseph White, which I feel like this is his debut. It's a young adult horror fantasy / sci-fi dystopian. A lot of body horror stuff in this one. This follows our main character, Benji, who's grown up in this religious cult that essentially made Armageddon happen, where they released this virus onto the world in the name of religion. Benji is like grown up with this, but he doesn't agree with it, and they've essentially planted another version of this disease within him that's gonna transform the cult into this all-powerful being, like use his body. And he flees from this because he doesn't want any of it. He's also trans, and this religious cult is like not accepting of that. So he flees, and he stumbles upon this queer sanctuary or youth group, essentially, but used to be a youth group before any of this happened. And they're just trying to live, essentially. And that's the first time Benji's discovered true acceptance, how the people just like accept his pronouns, his identity. You know, it's like the first time he's felt like that feeling in the midst of this like wild situation. So my first impressions when reading this book is that it's written like very typical young adult, and I will start off being really frustrated with it because I felt like this book was going to be different. And just to go on a little tangent, I don't really understand why young adult books tend to be written so similarly, because there's something about the genre young adult that kind of abstains from literary uniqueness in the language. And I feel like I don't really understand why that happens, because just because it's young adult doesn't mean that you can't take like freedom in the style of writing or your writing choices, you know? But somehow it just, the writing of young adult just seems to be very unanimous. Unanimous is not the word, but I hope you know what I mean. But then like as the story went on, I got so invested in like the characters and the plot that I just kind of got used to it and didn't think too much about it, and ended up like not really bothering me. So I was engaged throughout this whole book. I ended up giving it 4 stars. I really liked the different characters in this book, like at this queer youth center. I liked hearing the backstory, and the plot didn't unravel like in a way that to me was like ideal, but I enjoyed where the story went, and I liked the messaging and what it was saying. And I also liked the way it discussed religion, as just because this religious like cult kind of did all these horrible things to the world doesn't mean that religion itself is bad, which I think is like a very important point to touch on when like religion is used in this way, because there's many like queer religious people at this youth group. I heard someone talk about this book, about how it was kind of weird that there would be so much discussion about like gender and transness and queerness and pronouns and these different terms when it was kind of this like post-apocalyptic setting. I went into the book kind of knowing that that would frustrate me, or thinking that these elements would become like overbearing. But I think it's quite natural, like if you think about it, that Benji has never discovered these things and then all of a sudden gets all this information like dumped on him and being this complete new setting. I think it's very natural to have the forum to like discuss these things. And I think also people who are in dire situations talk about normal stuff, and also they care about, you know, being seen as who you are. I also think that you have to take into consideration that this is a fiction book, and whether it's realistic or not maybe doesn't really matter, because if a young trans person read this, the conversations and hearing what they're talking about these topics are more important and outweighs the fact if it's like realistic or not. So yeah, that didn't bother me. I just think it wasn't a 5-star book, but I'm glad I read it. I enjoyed it, and I'm interested in reading his other book, even though I've heard it's historical fiction, which is not my favorite. And the last book I read last year that's in this wrap up is Dirty Heads by Aaron Dries. This is about this boy who, in the beginning of the book, is essentially homeless, and he is just living off of scraps trying to get by, and he goes back to his childhood home, and then the story flashes back to what happens to where he grew up, how he ended up being like orphan, essentially a runaway, all alone. This is a horror, and it's also really, really sad in my opinion. It's very short, but I think what the author did here was great. Essentially, this person is, as a child, he's in denial about being gay, and he just like doesn't want to be gay. What he's heard about gay people is that they get AIDS and die, and it's gross. And I think it takes place in the 80s maybe, or 90s. Yeah, 1994. And he's obsessed with these horror films, and he goes to a video store, and he's not allowed to borrow the horror films, but he loves sketching the horror covers and has a sketchbook where he just like recreates this horror covers. And then what happens is that one of the creatures that he kind of sketches ends up being transformed into a physical being that starts terrorizing the family, and it just goes downhill from there. And I think it's supposed to be like an analogy for him not accepting himself, and then the fact that when you keep something inside, or when you don't see the truth for what it is, it will essentially manifest into something darker. And we just discover like secrets about his family. I thought it was really well written. It was very horror-y. The chapters are like counting backwards, so it starts with like biggest chapter number, and the last chapter is chapter 1. I don't know why the author did this. It doesn't really serve a purpose. It's a cosmic horror, and I think it was my first cosmic horror, if I'm not correct. And I'm interested in the cosmic horror genre because I did find this really interesting. I haven't heard anyone else talk about this. I just saw this cover and thought it was really, really cool. I really liked it. There's quite a few like trigger warnings in this one, though. It's an adult, and it uses a lot of slurs, and also like internalized homophobia. There's SA in this, very violent, and abuse and general horror, physical horror stuff. So be aware of that going into it. But I gave it 4 stars. I really liked it, and I haven't heard a lot of people talk about it, so I'm really excited I got to this. But it was really sad. The ending was really sad, and I just really wanted the best for this boy and his sister. Oh, his sister, you know. So there was a lot of like really great books that I read last month. Like, so many of these were hits. I think only really the bottom 2, the Eric LaRocca book and Scorched Sister, was the 2 that I wasn't a big fan of. All of the other ones I actually really enjoyed to some capacity. This right here is the order I would give the books, like if I were to rate them from best to least favorites. The top half of this, just like really enjoyed it. Amazing reading a month. Read so many books that I really enjoyed, and books that I've been wanting to read for a while, some new books. So that's super exciting. Thank you so much for joining me in this wrap up. Let me know what you've been reading lately, enjoying lately, and if you read any of these and your thoughts on the books. I hope you have a really amazing day, and I will talk to you soon.